There were no screams that night, only the faint hum of streetlights and the occasional shuffle of leaves dragged by a tired wind. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind that prided itself on peace and predictability. Yet beneath that fragile calm, something waited. It began with a smell, a faint sour odor that drifted across the yards after sundown like wet soil and rot. The residents noticed it but never spoke of it aloud. They whispered behind drawn curtains, exchanging glances at morning mailboxes. They said it came from the old house at the corner, the one whose curtains never opened, whose lawn remained perfectly trimmed even when no one was seen tending to it. Every town has a story like this, an address that parents warn their children about, a door that should never be knocked on. But in this street, that story was not just a whisper. It had form. It had eyes. And at night, when the lamps dimmed to a dull amber haze, something moved behind that window, something that watched. A retired mailman had once said he heard soft singing from that house when he passed by at dawn. Not a voice he could describe, but something that made his stomach twist as if the melody were stitched into his nerves. When he tried to tell the neighbors, they smiled politely and changed the subject. Denial was easier. After all, people wanted peace more than truth. The human mind could adapt to any terror as long as it was quiet enough. That house, number 31, had stood empty, or so they thought, for nearly 6 years. Its owner, an elderly woman named Ruth, had died suddenly. The story went that her body remained undiscovered for weeks until the odor reached the street. The authorities removed what was left of her and sealed the house. But the light in the upstairs room never truly went out. Some said it flickered on its own. Others claimed it was a reflection, or faulty wiring. Yet there was no power connected to the home anymore. One night, a new family moved in across the street, a young couple trying to start fresh, unaware of the whispers. Their first night was uneventful, but by the third, the woman woke to the sound of footsteps pacing slowly outside her window. Not hurried, not panicked, just a slow, deliberate pattern, heel, toe, pause. When she peered through the curtain, she saw no one. Only the empty house across the road. Its window was lit by a faint glow, too steady to be moonlight. She told her husband, who laughed it off, saying it was probably the motion light from the neighbor's garage. But there was no motion light. There never had been. The next morning, she noticed her flower pots had been moved, lined perfectly along the edge of her porch, all facing the old house. It seemed deliberate, almost ceremonial. She asked the mailman about it. He told her, without meeting her eyes, that it would be best not to question certain things on this street. He had seen what curiosity brought to others. By the end of that week, their cat disappeared. Then the smell returned. It came first as a faint odor in the evening air, like rusted metal or spoiled meat. Neighbors blamed a dead animal under the porch. Others said the sewer lines were backing up. But the scent thickened, especially near the fence facing the old house. At times it seemed to pulse, heavy and wet, like something living exhaling beneath the soil. The couple decided to call the town inspector. But before they could, they woke one night to a noise that made the hair on their arms stand. It was a knock. Not at their door, but from inside the wall behind their bed. 3 soft taps. Then silence. The woman sat frozen, her pulse pounding, her husband half asleep beside her. Again 3 taps. Then a dragging sound, as though something were crawling along the inside of the wall. She whispered his name, but before he could respond, the sound stopped. And then came the voice. It was faint, muffled, almost tender. A woman's voice whispering from behind the plaster. It said only one word: cold. When they tore the wall open the next day, they found nothing. No pipes, no animals. Only a hollow cavity between the studs. Inside that hollow was a single object wrapped in brittle paper, a small photograph, faded and water-stained. It showed the old woman, Ruth, standing in the yard with a dark shape behind her. The shadow resembled a person, but the outline was wrong, elongated and wrong-footed, like something trying to mimic a human stance. The couple moved out within a week, but the house did not stay empty for long. Tenants came and went. Each time they left abruptly, no forwarding addresses, no explanations. The real estate agent eventually stopped listing it. People began crossing the street when walking past, avoiding even looking at its porch. At night, when fog crept low and the air turned thick with silence, those who lived nearby could still hear that faint singing, the same melody the mailman had described, always just beyond clear hearing, always coming from the same upstairs room. And then came the night when the smell spread across the entire neighborhood. Police were called, reports were filed, and yet no one could determine the source. They entered the abandoned home with respirators and flashlights. They never disclosed what they found inside. But the windows were boarded the next morning. The street fell quiet once again. Yet the smell persisted. It clung to the air, invisible but undeniable, a reminder that something remained buried beneath the peace they pretended to have. Some residents moved away, unable to sleep through the nights. Others stayed, telling themselves it was nothing more than damp wood, mildew, or memory. But on some nights, when the air turned cold and heavy, a few claimed to see movement behind those boarded windows, a hand pressing softly against the glass, a silhouette swaying in rhythm to a song no one else could hear. Every town has its stories. Some fade with time. Others linger like stains that will not wash away. This one never faded, because every time someone new moved into that neighborhood, the first thing they said was the same. There is something wrong with the house at the corner. And if you ever find yourself walking alone at night, in a quiet neighborhood where the wind carries faint music from somewhere unseen, ask yourself, how well do you really know the people who live next door? The house had always been there, older than the trees that shaded the street, older even than the cracked asphalt that coiled through the town like a forgotten vein. Long before the cul-de-sac had filled with manicured lawns and motion lights, there had been only that single two-story house standing alone on the hill. Built sometime around the late 1940s, its architecture was plain, functional, with narrow windows and steep eaves that cast long shadows when the sun sank low. The wood siding had once been white, now blistered to gray. It looked like any other home from a distance. But up close, people often felt a faint discomfort, an invisible weight pressing down on their chest. Older residents recalled that the house had been built by a quiet man who rarely spoke. He worked nights at the train depot and lived there with his wife. They were never seen together in town. She was said to be fragile, pale, and polite, always appearing in long sleeves even during the summer. One winter, she vanished without a word. The husband claimed she had gone to visit family upstate, but when he died years later, no relatives ever came to claim his things. During the estate sale, buyers found women's clothes carefully folded in the attic, all untouched by dust, as if someone had been living there still. After that, the house passed through hands. A school teacher owned it for a decade before she too left suddenly. No one knew why. She had been stable, loved by students, known for her kindness. Then one morning, her classroom stood empty. All she left behind was a letter on her desk that said, "I cannot sleep through the whispering anymore." Her house remained locked for months, the windows covered, until it was eventually sold again. The town learned to stop asking questions. By the 1980s, the neighborhood had grown around the hill. Families came for the peace, the quiet, the illusion of safety. No one wanted to acknowledge the stain in their midst. But history does not vanish, it waits. And that house, unlike its owners, never forgot. When the elderly woman named Ruth moved in during the early 2000s, people were relieved. She seemed like a stable presence. A retired nurse, she had lived most of her life caring for others. Her arrival brought a brief calm, a sense that perhaps the house could be normal again. She repainted the porch, planted roses, and waved to passing cars. For the first time in years, laughter was heard from its walls. Then came the winter of her death. No one knew the exact day. The mail piled up slowly. Her porch light remained on even during daylight. The neighbors began to notice an odor, faint at first, then growing heavier. One man claimed he saw Ruth standing at her window long after she was supposed to have passed, staring down the street as though counting the houses. When the authorities entered, the details of what they found never became public. The coroner mentioned something unusual about the condition of the remains. Unusual enough that the town's small morgue sent photographs to the state lab. Those records, like most inconvenient truths, disappeared quietly. A few months later, the property went up for sale again. The realtor, a woman named Karen, had handled hundreds of houses in her career. She was professional, calm, unshaken by the grief or superstition that often came with her job. But something about that listing disturbed her. She once told a colleague, "Every time I unlocked the door, the temperature dropped. Not just cold, different, like the air was breathing back at me." The first real sign that something was wrong came one summer night, when the air hung too still and the moon sat swollen and yellow over the cul-de-sac. The new tenant, a man in his early 30s who had moved in without fanfare, was seen unloading boxes until after midnight. He had no family, no friends visiting, and he rarely spoke to anyone. The neighbors described him as polite but distant. He waved when he needed to, smiled when required, and kept to himself. That suited the street fine. After all, peace was valuable, and strangers eventually blended into the silence. But that silence began to fracture. It started with the lights. A soft flickering from the upstairs window that pulsed like a heartbeat. At first, people assumed it was faulty wiring, but the pattern was too deliberate. 3 flashes, pause, 3 flashes again, always between 1 and 2 in the morning. The mailman noticed it first, though he pretended not to care. Later, a teenager walking his dog saw it too and claimed the light flickered only when someone was standing in front of the window. When asked how he knew, he said he saw the silhouette move. A figure tall and motionless, head tilted toward the street as though listening. The man who had rented the house said nothing about it, but he began appearing outside more often at night, standing by the fence smoking in the dark, his eyes fixed on the window above him. Neighbors noticed that he stopped turning on his porch light altogether, as if he wanted to stay unseen. Someone asked him once if everything was all right in the house. He smiled, said it was fine, and then asked quietly, "Do you ever hear it humming?" When pressed on what he meant, he only shook his head and went back inside. Days turned into weeks, and the smell came back. It seeped through the fences and hedges, faint but unmistakable. The same heavy metallic scent that made the back of the throat tighten. The town's waste management team checked the drains, found nothing. The air quality inspector said it might be old insulation or mold, but he never entered the basement. He had stood at the top of the stairs, paused for several minutes, and left abruptly without saying a word. He quit his job the following month. Children walking home from school began avoiding the sidewalk in front of the house. They said the ground there felt soft, like stepping on something hollow. One girl told her mother she heard whispering coming from beneath the soil. Her mother laughed it off as imagination until she walked past one evening and heard it herself. An indistinct murmur like a conversation carried through the floorboards. She froze until it stopped, then hurried away. She told no one. Inside, the tenant began keeping a journal. The entries, found much later, painted a picture of slow descent. The first pages were neat, almost cheerful. He wrote about how quiet the street was, how peaceful the night seemed. Then by the 4th week, the handwriting grew erratic. He wrote about the voices, about how he would wake up at exactly 3:11 a.m. every night, to the sound of something walking in the attic. He said it was not footsteps at first, more like dragging, as if someone were crawling on their stomach. Then came the smell. Sour, old, damp, and thick, seeping through the vents even when the windows were open. He began hearing faint tapping inside the walls, always in threes. He knocked back once out of frustration. Something answered. By the 5th week, he stopped sleeping upstairs. He moved into the living room, setting up a makeshift bed on the couch. He wrote that sometimes the television turned itself onto static. He described seeing faint movement behind the flicker of the screen, a reflection of someone standing behind him, though no one was there when he turned. He tried to rationalize it, electrical interference, exhaustion, anxiety. But the journal entries grew darker, fragmented, as though written during moments of panic. He mentioned hearing someone humming through the vents. The same soft tune the previous residents had described years ago. The sound came from below the house, he said, from the space near the foundation. He tried recording it once, but the audio captured only static and a faint rhythmic pulse, like breathing. Then came the photographs. A delivery worker found a stack of them scattered near the mailbox one morning. All were printed in black and white, all showing the house from different angles. But in each photograph, the same detail appeared, a figure standing at the upstairs window. The figure looked almost human, but its limbs seemed wrong, too long, bent slightly backward as though its joints were reversed. The face was blurred, but the outline of a mouth was visible, wide, smiling. The delivery worker dropped the photos on the porch and left immediately. That evening, the tenant was seen sitting in his car for hours, staring at the front door. He looked pale, almost sick. At one point, he got out, walked to the edge of the yard, and dug into the soil with his bare hands. Neighbors thought he had lost something. In reality, he claimed he had heard knocking from underground. When police later reviewed the area after his disappearance, they found the ground disturbed, long, narrow trenches running parallel beneath the grass, as if someone or something had tunneled from below. No signs of struggle, no footprints other than his own. The back door was locked from the inside. The journal ended abruptly after a final entry. It is not the house that is haunted. It is the ground beneath it. The earth here remembers what has been buried, and sometimes it exhales. After that night, no one saw the tenant again. His car remained parked out front for weeks before being towed. The property was declared abandoned once more, and the familiar silence returned. Yet those living nearby could not ignore the change in the air. The street that once felt calm now felt watched. Curtains remained drawn. Dogs refused to approach the corner yard, and sometimes, in the earliest hours of morning, the light from the upstairs window flickered 3 times, paused, then flickered again. One neighbor claimed she saw someone standing there again, but this time it was not the tenant. It was the old woman. The same gray hair, the same hollow stare, the same smile, and somewhere far below the earth came the faint sound of humming, steady, soft, and patient, as though something buried beneath the house had started to wake. The police records from that period were thin, reduced to half-filled forms and a few grainy photographs of the property. Officially, the man who rented the house was classified as missing under unclear circumstances. Unofficially, the officers who entered the house that morning refused to return. According to the surviving report, the air inside was cold enough to miss their breath, though the power had been disconnected for months. They described the scent as organic decay mixed with ozone, the strange electrical smell that follows lightning strikes. The front room was untouched, yet a thin layer of ash covered the floor like dust from a long extinguished fire. When they stepped further inside, their boots left no prints. The ash absorbed everything. The living room walls were scratched in wide arcs as though someone had dragged a metal object across them. At the center of the room, a circle had been drawn in soot, filled with symbols that looked neither religious nor random. They repeated in patterns, almost mathematical, spiraling inward to a single point marked by a handprint. The print was small, too small to belong to the missing man, yet it was pressed deep enough to crack the surface of the wood. They took photographs, sealed the house again, and filed the case away under unresolved incident. None of them returned to finish the report. A few weeks later, one of the younger officers requested leave. He had developed insomnia. He told his partner that every night since entering the house, he woke up at exactly 3:11 a.m. He said he heard faint tapping from the inside of his bedroom wall, followed by a woman's voice whispering his name. His partner assumed it was stress, until he too began hearing the same sound at the same hour. Within a month, both men had left town. Local curiosity filled the silence they left behind. Paranormal enthusiasts visited the area, slipping through the fence to take photographs and conduct their investigations. Most of them left disappointed, claiming the house was quiet, lifeless. But one group uploaded footage that drew attention for all the wrong reasons. The video lasted only 17 seconds before the screen cut to static. In those seconds, the camera panned across the hallway toward the kitchen. A shadow passed quickly across the frame. Too fast to identify, yet its reflection lingered in the glass of the door for several seconds longer than it should have. The reflection smiled. Viewers argued over the clip for months, analyzing frames, enhancing contrast, dissecting every pixel. Some said it was a hoax. Others swore they saw details that could not have been faked. The eyes in the reflection seemed aware of the camera, shifting slightly to follow it. And when the footage cut to static, a faint sound could be heard underneath the distortion. A single word spoken softly. Cold. A journalist named Evelyn took interest in the case. She was known for exposing local myths, turning ghost stories into forgotten tragedies with research and logic. She arrived with recorders, a notebook, and no patience for superstition. She spent days combing through archives, interviewing residents, piecing together what history would allow. The deeper she went, the more she noticed a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Every 31 years, a tenant from that property vanished. The names changed, but the pattern did not. In each case, the disappearance occurred within 2 months of moving in. In each case, the investigation found traces of rot in the soil around the foundation, even in dry seasons. And in each case, neighbors reported the same thing: lights in the upper window and the faint scent of decay drifting through the night. Evelyn mapped the timeline meticulously, marking every incident on paper. When she finished, she noticed something even stranger. The dates of each disappearance aligned almost perfectly with the lunar cycle, each occurring on a full moon that followed. The first frost of the season she dismissed. Superstition, but could not ignore repetition. She obtained access to the old land deeds and discovered the property boundaries had been altered several times throughout history. The original lot had been larger, extending down to a dry creek bed that was later filled in when the neighborhood expanded. Underneath that fill lay the foundation stones of a much older dwelling, one that had been burned to the ground sometime in the late 1800s. The cause of the fire was never determined, but a single line in the town ledger mentioned it. Home destroyed after discovery of buried remains beneath hearth. Evelyn found this detail buried in microfilm, but before she could publish, strange things began to happen. Her phone started ringing at 3:11 a.m. every night. The caller ID always read unknown, and when she answered, there was only static. Until faintly, beneath the static, came that same melody others had described, a soft humming that almost resembled a lullaby. She stopped answering, but the calls continued. Eventually, she disconnected her line. The next morning, her recorder, which she always kept off at night, contained 3 minutes of audio. It was her own voice whispering, "Still here." She contacted a sound analyst to review the tape. He confirmed the voice matched hers, but the background frequencies were unnatural. He said it sounded like several layers of low-frequency vibrations, almost geological, as if the microphone had picked up movement from beneath the ground. When he slowed the recording, he found additional whispering, different voices overlapping, some crying, others repeating words too distorted to understand. Evelyn never published her article. The sound analyst died weeks later in an electrical fire that consumed his apartment. The origin was traced to a recorder left plugged into the wall. After that, even skeptics began to avoid the story. The footage was deleted, the archives closed for restoration, and the house once again sank into silence. But there were rumors among the few who still lived nearby. They said a new light appeared behind the boarded windows, a faint blue glow like that of an old cathode screen. Sometimes, when fog rolled through the street, silhouettes appeared in that light, human shapes moving slowly, as though submerged in water. A geologist passing through the area once took soil samples from the yard, out of curiosity. He never revealed his findings publicly, but his assistant later said the results were impossible. The soil beneath the house contained unusually high traces of bone dust and carbon, consistent with repeated burning and burial. The layers suggested the process had occurred over centuries, not years. And though no official report acknowledged it, the assistant also claimed something else. He said when they extracted the final core sample, they heard a faint sound from the hole, a sigh, long and trembling, as if air trapped for generations had been released. He had looked into the opening with his flashlight and thought, for an instant, that something inside had reflected his light back. He quit his job that week and refused to discuss it again. The town stopped asking questions. The police stopped responding to calls from that street. And yet, on nights when the wind dies and the world goes still, the neighbors swear they can hear that same low hum rising from beneath the soil, vibrating softly through their floorboards, like the earth whispering to itself. The house had long stopped needing to move to be noticed. It was enough that it simply existed. The longer it stood, the more it began to live in the minds of those around it, an infection that started as curiosity and ended as sleeplessness. People who had once laughed off the rumors found themselves waking in the middle of the night for no reason at all, staring out their windows toward that dark corner lot. It was as if the house pulled at something primitive, an instinct older than understanding, a fear that did not rely on proof. Those who lived closest began to change first. One woman who lived directly across the street started keeping her curtains closed at all times. Her husband said she became paranoid, claiming she could hear breathing whenever she stood near the window. She would press her ear against the glass at night, insisting that someone was standing on the lawn whispering her name. The doctors called it stress-induced psychosis, but when she was committed, she told nurses that her hallucinations only stopped when she was far from home. Whenever she returned to town for treatment sessions, she said the whispers returned. Another resident, an elderly man who had lived on the street since it was built, stopped tending his yard. His grass grew tall, his mail piled up, and his dog barked endlessly through the nights. Neighbors said he began speaking to himself in the dark. Once, a teenager walking past swore he heard the man pleading softly through his open window, saying, "I did not look, I did not see, I did not open the door." Days later, the man was found dead in his chair. The coroner ruled it heart failure, but his eyes were wide open, and the skin around his mouth had torn in a way that suggested he had been trying to keep something from forcing its way in. The smell returned soon after his death. The same sickly sweet rot that no one could explain. The few who remained on the street described an atmosphere that could not be seen, but was constantly felt. The air seemed heavier, almost viscous, as though it resisted every movement. Radios picked up static, clocks stopped at strange hours, and animals refused to enter the area. Birds flew over the block but never landed. One night, a family living several houses away recorded the sound of what they thought was thunder. When they replayed it later, they realized it was not thunder at all. It was rhythmic. It sounded like something knocking deep beneath the ground. The psychological decay was subtle but collective. Neighbors began turning on each other, accusing one another of trespassing, of playing tricks, of spreading hysteria. They filed noise complaints, demanded police patrols, and installed cameras. Yet the recordings always showed the same thing. Nothing. Just still air, shadows, and the faint shimmer of heat distortion, as though the world itself trembled slightly near the property line. Some people fled. Others stayed because they were drawn to it. Curiosity was a strange kind of gravity. They told themselves they were not afraid, that they only wanted to understand. But the truth was darker. The house had become a mirror for whatever people tried to hide. Those who carried guilt, regret, or grief found it reflected back at them in ways they could not escape. One man, a contractor hired to reinforce the property fence, claimed he began dreaming about the house weeks before he had even taken the job. In his dreams, he said he was standing in the basement, though he had never been inside. He could hear dripping water and see his own shadow stretching across the floor toward something that moved in the darkness. Each morning, he woke with his hands covered in dirt, though his nails were clean before bed. When he finally entered the basement during work, he froze. The smell, the dripping, exactly as in his dreams. He refused to continue and quit before the week was over. A month later, he was found wandering along a distant highway barefoot, muttering about faces in the walls. Psychologists who studied the few surviving accounts called it a localized psychogenic contagion, a form of mass hysteria. But that explanation could not account for the physical evidence, the temperature drops, the consistent smells, the synchronized dreams. Families reported the same nightmares on the same nights. They dreamt of narrow tunnels filled with whispering voices, of being buried alive in soil that pulsed like muscle. One woman described seeing her deceased mother sitting at the foot of her bed, humming that same lullaby the journalist had recorded years before. It was not just the sound or the smell. It was the feeling, the awareness of being watched from behind walls that should have been solid. Some residents reported catching glimpses of movement inside the boarded house when headlights from passing cars swept across its facade. Others swore they saw reflections in its windows even when there was no light to reflect. One child described seeing someone walking upside down on the ceiling through a crack in the wood. By then, the community had fractured completely. Realtors refused to list nearby properties. Property values fell, and the once cheerful neighborhood became a forgotten patch of silence. People stopped mentioning the house at all, as if refusing to name it would strip it of power. Yet that silence only fed the tension. Those who stayed found their own homes changing in subtle ways. Doors left open that they were sure they had closed, footprints on floors they had just cleaned, and shadows that lingered too long after movement stopped. The mind, when pressed between disbelief and dread, begins to rot. People became hollow versions of themselves. Their laughter faded, their conversations shortened, and their eyes grew tired and unfocused, as if always listening for something distant. The neighborhood became a portrait of slow corrosion, not by force but by fear. One evening, a power outage swept through the area. The entire block was drowned in darkness, yet from the corner house a faint blue glow leaked through the cracks of its boarded windows. The neighbors watched from their porches, too terrified to move, as that light pulsed rhythmically like the beating of a heart. The smell grew thick again and the air began to hum. When the power returned, the light was gone. But several residents reported hearing a single knock on their walls at the exact same time. 3 soft taps, followed by silence. That was the night the last family left. They packed before dawn, refusing to even speak of what they had heard. And when their moving truck pulled away, the street fell into an unnatural calm. No cars, no voices, no sound but the slow sigh of the wind through the empty lots. Yet those who drive by now say the curtains in the old house are no longer boarded. They hang loose, moving slightly as if stirred by breath from within. Some say that if you park outside at exactly 3:11 a.m. and listen carefully, you can hear humming beneath the ground, soft, patient, and unending. No one who has tried to record it ever made it through the night. Theories began forming like mold, quietly, invisibly, spreading in the dark corners of conversation. The official explanation remained the same: urban legend, coincidence, psychological contagion. The police report spoke of local folklore, the mayor called it a story for tourists, and the town's website scrubbed all mentions of the address. But human beings cannot leave horror unanswered. Every silence demands a reason. Every mystery breeds obsession. And so theories grew. The first was the simplest. The house was cursed. A relic of the land it was built on. The town historian, before he died, had hinted that the property once stood on a burial site. Not a cemetery, but a pit where plague victims were thrown during an epidemic that predated written records. Some believed the foundations were laid over those bones, that something ancient was buried and bound, whispering through the soil. People spoke of the rot beneath the roots, a phrase that circulated through town like an infection of language. It meant something festering under beauty, something that never decayed because it was never allowed to rest. The second theory came from science, or what passed for it. A group of university students arrived to conduct electromagnetic studies, claiming that strange phenomena could be traced to geological activity. The house, they said, sat atop a rare type of rock formation that emitted low-frequency vibrations. Those frequencies, under the right atmospheric pressure, could cause hallucinations, shadows moving in peripheral vision, sensations of being watched, and even auditory distortions. The students stayed 3 nights. On the first night, they recorded static, pulses of energy that repeated in a pattern. On the second night, they captured a sound none of them could explain. It resembled breathing, slow and wet like air forced through a narrow space. They left on the third night without collecting their equipment. When the police entered weeks later, all their gear was found melted, fused into the floor as if by intense heat. The data cards were blank. Another theory tied the events to human tragedy. A retired detective who had investigated the first disappearance decades earlier claimed that the house might have been a site of ritual killings. He said early police archives mentioned anomalous burials behind the foundation, bones arranged in geometric patterns, carved with marks resembling those later found on the living room floor. He believed the symbols were not random but part of an ongoing act, an attempt to preserve something through repetition. He died 2 days after giving that interview. His home burned to the ground that same night, leaving nothing but a melted recorder beside his chair. A more contemporary explanation linked everything to the old woman. Ruth, some believed she had not died naturally. They said she had been conducting seances, trying to contact her dead husband, and had opened something she could not close. The humming that people heard, they said, was not a song. It was the sound of her voice caught between worlds, repeating endlessly, trapped in the air of that house. Paranormal researchers called it a looped haunting, where the boundary between memory and presence dissolves. But those who entered the house claimed the humming responded to them. It grew louder when they spoke. It stopped when they prayed. Still others argued that it was not Ruth at all, that she had been only the latest vessel. They believed the house used people, fed on them in a way not of blood but of presence. Fear was its sustenance, silence its breath. The longer someone lived there, the more the house mirrored them. They said this explained why neighbors saw familiar faces in the windows, why the missing man's reflection was later seen smiling back from the glass. The house was not haunted by people. It was haunted with them. The strangest theory came from a priest. He was an older man who had once lived in the area before leaving the clergy. He said he had been called to bless the house after Ruth's death. When he entered, he felt the air shift, as though he had stepped into the lungs of something enormous. He refused to proceed with the ritual, but before leaving, he looked down at the floor and saw the wood swelling slightly, as if breathing beneath his feet. He later described the house as a wound pretending to be a home. He believed that the property marked a convergence point, a place where boundaries between worlds had thinned. He said that every 31 years the ground needed to exhale, to release what it held. Those who happened to live there during that cycle became part of the exhalation. He claimed the pattern aligned not just with lunar cycles, but with deep tidal shifts of the Earth's core, that something older than human death was trying to rise. His writings were confiscated after he was found wandering the woods at night, his lips stitched shut with wire. Government agencies briefly became involved. A geophysical research team surveyed the area under the pretext of soil stability tests. Neighbors reported hearing drilling at odd hours and seeing unmarked vans parked by the property. The next morning, the house was fenced off and the street closed for 24 hours. When residents asked questions, they were told a gas leak had occurred. Yet that night, from every direction, the sound of humming could be heard, not from within the house, but from the ground beneath their feet. It lasted precisely 3 minutes and 11 seconds. No agency returned after that. The street was reopened, but all records of the inspection vanished. The townspeople learned not to ask questions about men in uniforms or fences that appeared overnight. And though the fence was later removed, those who crossed the yard said their compasses spun uselessly and their phones died without warning. In time, the town divided into believers and deniers. The believers avoided the area, built their lives elsewhere, and whispered prayers when they passed its name. The deniers moved closer, convinced that facing the story would banish it. But both sides agreed on one thing. When the wind blew through that part of town, it carried voices. Not loud enough to form words, just enough to make silence unbearable. And now, decades later, the theories have multiplied beyond count. Some say it was a government experiment gone wrong. Others claim it was an ancient burial ritual. A few insist it is something far simpler, that it is a reflection of us. That every act of cruelty, every death ignored, every silence forced into the earth eventually gathers weight until the ground itself remembers. And when it remembers too much, it breathes it back out through the cracks. That house is only one of many. There are others scattered across towns and countries, waiting quietly beneath layers of denial, waiting for the next full frost, waiting for the next name on the deed, waiting to exhale again. Years passed and the town grew around the silence like scar tissue. People forgot the names, but not the feeling. Children who once whispered about the house became adults who refused to discuss it, though their eyes would drift toward the hill when the wind shifted. The property remained abandoned. Grass grew high, swallowing the fence, while ivy crawled up the siding like veins reaching toward something still alive. Real estate agents stopped listing it. The town council fenced it off again, then again after the first barrier rotted away. No one knew who paid for it. No one wanted to. It was as if the house had slipped out of ownership entirely, belonging now only to the quiet that surrounded it. Yet quiet does not mean peace. It only means waiting. The few who still lived nearby said the house never decayed as it should have. Its roof sagged but never collapsed, its windows clouded but never shattered. Even the boards over the glass remained firm despite decades of weather. One storm tore shingles from every home on the block, except that one. When lightning struck the hill, it split the oak beside the property in two, but the house itself stood untouched, its silhouette bright for one blinding instant before sinking back into shadow. After that storm, the humming returned. It began faintly, low enough to be mistaken for memory. A vibration beneath the earth, rhythmic and shallow like something turning over in its sleep. People noticed it only at night between 3 and 4 in the morning, when the air grew still and heavy. It did not echo. It absorbed. Standing near the property felt like standing beside an immense lung. The sound was not loud, but it pressed on the chest, subtle and physical, as though the ground wanted to breathe through you. The town once again divided, between those who denied it and those who could no longer sleep through it. Some moved away, leaving houses half-packed. Others stayed because they had nowhere else to go, learning to live with it the way one lives with pain. The grocery clerk near the edge of town said the air felt different now, sharper, carrying a scent like metal after rain. "It's in the dust," he said once to a customer who never came back. "You can smell it if you dig your hands into the ground." One night, a drifter passing through took shelter in the house. His name was never known. He broke in through the back door, leaving a faint trail of footprints through the tall grass. A group of teenagers claimed they saw him enter just before midnight. By sunrise, he was gone. Only his coat remained, laid neatly across the porch railing. The inside was lined with ash. The police came, but they did not enter. The chief told reporters the ground was unstable, that the foundation had shifted. But a neighbor said he saw the front door swing open hours later, as though the house itself had exhaled. The humming stopped for a week after that, then returned stronger. People described it differently now, no longer as a vibration, but as a harmony of distant voices blending beneath the earth. Some heard crying, others laughter. One man swore he heard his late wife calling his name from under the lawn. He dug for hours before collapsing. They said when they pulled him out, his hands were raw, his nails black with soil. He never spoke again. In the following months, sinkholes began to appear across the block. Small at first, then larger, always perfectly round. The ground seemed to cave inward, not crumble. Workers filled them, but the soil never settled. It pulsed faintly when touched. Local geologists blamed water erosion, though the area had been dry for years. The holes appeared in a pattern, aligning precisely with the outlines of long-demolished homes recorded on the town's oldest maps. Every hole marked where a family had once vanished. The town eventually sealed the road leading to the hill. Signs warned of instability, though everyone knew that was not the reason. The asphalt cracked over time, forming strange branching patterns like roots or veins spreading outward. In summer heat, the cracks widened, releasing that same metallic scent. No one repaired them. No one dared to touch them. Still, people came. Ghost hunters, journalists, drifters chasing stories. None stayed long. One live streamer managed to record 32 minutes before his feed cut out. The last image was of the hallway inside, dark, empty, except for something faintly reflective on the wall. When authorities retrieved his camera days later, they found no blood, no sign of struggle. Only a single fingerprint pressed into the lens, small, deep, and perfectly preserved in dust. The footage went viral before it was taken down. Some viewers claimed that for a moment before the feed cut, the reflection moved toward the camera. Others insisted that the reflection was not of the man at all, but of someone standing behind him, smiling. After that, the story spread again. Online forums dissected every frame, every rumor. Some swore the house was a government black site. Others claimed it was a tear between worlds. But the most unsettling theory came quietly, from those who had lived there long enough to feel its rhythm. They said the house was not unique. They said the hum was not localized to that property anymore. It had begun spreading, faintly at first, detectable through ground sensors miles away. The sound was identical. Low frequency, steady, pulsing every 3 minutes and 11 seconds. When questioned, the local council said the data was misread, that there was nothing alive beneath the soil. But nights in the region grew colder, and animals started migrating early as if fleeing from something they could sense but humans could not. In the end, the house was bulldozed under official order. The crew arrived at dawn, heavily equipped, silent. They finished before noon. By evening, nothing remained. No foundation, no boards, only a flat scar of earth. For a brief moment, people felt relief. The air lightened. The smell vanished. Children played outside again. And then, weeks later, the humming returned, not from the hill, from below the entire street. Residents reported hearing it through their floors, their drains, their walls. At first, it came softly, like a memory fading in and out. Then one night, every light on the street flickered 3 times, paused, and flickered again. At exactly 3:11 a.m., every clock in town stopped. It was no longer a single house. It was everywhere the soil had touched. The town eventually emptied. Maps erased its name. Yet even now, travelers passing that region at night claim they can see faint lights in the distance, an outline of a house where no house stands, windows glowing softly, like eyes half open. Some say if you stand close enough, the ground beneath your feet vibrates, carrying a heartbeat not your own. Others say that if you listen long enough, you will hear your name whispered back to you. Maybe that is the final truth. Maybe the house was never haunted at all. Maybe it was listening, recording every sound, every life, every silence, and now it simply wants to be heard. And maybe, even as you sit here in the comfort of your own home, reading these words or watching this story, you should take a moment to listen. Listen closely. Beneath the hum of your refrigerator, beneath the wind outside your window, beneath your own heartbeat. Something is breathing there, something that remembers.